On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. It's a very famous cartoon, and I was surprised to learn that it was actually published 19 years ago on the 5th of July. And 19 years ago, identity was an issue on the internet, and today, identity probably still is an issue on the internet. If I go back and look at my experience in dealing with identity and identity issues on web-based transactions, one of the earliest projects I got involved in was actually with John Bullard when he was at Barclays. It was to do with the setting up of identities. And at that time, the concerns people had were that e-commerce would not take off because nobody knew who they were dealing with. Therefore, it was important to have some kind of digital authentication and digital identity online. And then in part, that was the genesis behind identities. As things have worked out, actually, e-commerce has taken off pretty damn well, without a huge degree of certainty around who you're dealing with, who the customer is or who the supplier is. The initial reticence of consumers in particular to get onto the internet seems to have gone. In fact, if anything, they're probably a little bit too blasé when it comes to who they're dealing with. Hence the easy ability for some organizations to defraud consumers. What's the purpose behind electronic identity? Well, in terms of PKI, when we were looking at this 10, 15 years ago, there were 4 criteria, but 2 were specific to identity. Authentication, who you're dealing with, and from a contracting point of view, non-repudiation. Very important to know that once you've signed something, once you've committed to something, that it cannot all unravel. And we can talk about that later on in the panel, but I think that was one of the more interesting areas when it comes to looking at the law and how the law is developing in relation to digital identity and electronic signatures. The other aspect of the PKI side of things was integrity and confidentiality. So the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, for want of a better term, that used to go together: authentication, non-repudiation, integrity, and confidentiality. The integrity being that if I receive some kind of transactional information or I receive a document that has been signed, I have confidence that what I received was actually what was sent, because any changes that might happen going through the internet, because maybe there's a man-in-the-middle attack or something like that, those changes would be immediately obvious when you're using a security system like PKI. And confidentiality, well, in some cases you may not care whether or not somebody can read your correspondence. In other cases, you may want to have things encrypted. So security is also very interesting. Now, the legal regime in which we operate is based on a directive in relation to electronic signatures. However, that directive is likely to be abolished. Earlier last month, beginning of June, the Commission published a draft regulation dealing with a digital identity or electronic identity and trust services for electronic transactions. The Commission has taken the view, quite rightly I think, that the Electronic Signatures Directive hasn't worked. It was there to deal with signatures, it wasn't there to deal with identity. We have a fragmented market in Europe, and if you're going to try and do international transactions, and the whole idea is in the European dream is that we have one market, a borderless market, having fragmented laws and fragmented implementations of the legislation increase costs. So one of the reasons that the Commission has come up with a regulation is that it means there is no implementation on a local basis. The regulation will apply across Europe, and we won't have the Italian interpretation or the French or the German, etc., etc. Going to the issues that I think are important when it comes to identity and commitment and signing, dealing with the non-repudiation, etc., is the current legislation says certain types of electronic signatures will be given equivalent effect to a handwritten signature. And that theory, that premise works its way through in the draft regulation. But what does that mean? And this is where I get concerned, where you want to have true interaction electronically without having a pre-existing contractual relationship. It's very easy to deal with issues where I sign a contract with you saying that we're going to communicate in this way and there's certain consequences of certain things happening. But if we'd not had any relationship beforehand and I send you something that's signed electronically, what are the consequences if the signature is invalid in some way? So let's go back to the paper world. I go into a shop. In the analog world, I take out my checkbook and I sign a check, I hand it over. In the old days, they would look at your card, your check guarantee card to see if the signature's matched. If the signature's matched, the shopkeeper would deal with the transaction, take your check. Now, if the signature's matched, but I was not the person who was authorized to sign the checkbook, then the transaction's void. The check is not valid because it wasn't signed by the proper person. So in the electronic world, when I receive something that's signed electronically, it will have been signed by somebody using a token probably, may have typed in some kind of passphrase. I know that what I've received has been signed. I know the certificate's valid. I know that the communication hasn't been modified in any shape, way, or form. And if it's a special type qualified electronic signature, it's given equivalent effects to a handwritten signature. What happens if the person to whom the token had been issued, the certificate has been issued to, wasn't the one who put it into the reader and typed in the passphrase? Is that the equivalent of a forged, but a perfectly forged signature? Is the transaction void? I don't know the answer to that question. Now, the way I would deal with it today is through a closed network. I would have a contract with them in financial services terms. You'd have a contract with your customer. You'd say that if the token has been used, this signature has been validated and hasn't been revoked or suspended, then I'm entitled to rely on that. We'll put aside the Payment Services Directive issue. That's another thing. But even if the person to whom the card has been issued or the certificate has been issued didn't affect the transaction, they may be bound by it because that's what we've agreed. And it may have been a secretary used in the same way as your secretary might use your credit card. You probably wouldn't challenge the transaction, but technically she may not be authorized. So that's the first question. If the signature hasn't been generated by the person to whom the device was issued to, what is the legal consequence further on down the line? And how do I prove that the signature was forged or is not? It's the electronic equivalent of a forged, perfect forgery. The other issue which I have a concern about is, and this is a major issue today in relation to the devices and the technology you use to affect the signing of documents to produce the super signatures, I call them, under the current directive, something that will live on in the next iteration of the draft regulation. It's very difficult to actually understand when the technology meets the technical criteria that the Commission have set. Do you self-certify? I go and look at the technology and say, yeah, we meet the criteria, therefore we fall within the definition of the signature creation device, the qualified e-signature creation device, which would be the new term. Do I have to have it certified by some third-party organisation, by a standards organisation? Is it certified by a government department? And across Europe, it's different in every jurisdiction, which is one of the reasons why the Commission wants to change the legislation. But what happens if I've got some technology which we've gone through the testing process, tick the box, yes, it complies with the text of the legislation, and then a year later somebody finds there's a systemic problem with the technology? Does that mean all signatures that have been generated using these secure signature creation devices are not signatures at all? And if that is the case, then all the transactions that took place beforehand may be unraveling. If they're not void, they may be voidable. So that means you have to challenge them and prove or allege that it wasn't created by the person who claimed it was going to be created. And maybe the risk of that is low. But if it's void, then the consequences are significant. And again, that's an area I think that we haven't really got our heads around. The way we deal with it today, we have contracts, closed networks, and the issue doesn't really arise. I'm not going to go into any detail. You'll be glad to know about the draft regulation, but there's a couple of points to observe. One is that they've come up with the concept of a qualified seal. So companies can't sign things electronically but we're all familiar with the concept of the company seal, and I think this is maybe one of the ways that we can get around some of the issues I'm concerned about. In the olden days, when you had the old seal, the company secretary would lock it away in the safe because company documents had to have the seal affixed to it. And once it was affixed, then they were pretty much binding, regardless of who did the affixing. Holding onto that seal was of paramount importance. Maybe that's the way we should look at electronic signatures. Once you've been given the device, it's the electronic equivalent of a seal. Keep it safe, because you will be bound by whatever is sealed using that device or token. Maybe that's something we should think about. A couple of other things. Full and flush with success with the draft regulation on data protection, where data breaches had to be notified within 24 hours or as soon as possible. The Commission decided this is a good idea for trust service providers. If the trust service provider has suffered a security breach, they must inform their regulatory body. Now, the regulation is light touch. You register, you have some kind of audit to say that you're secure, and they've ticked their box. But if you are registered and there is a security breach, you must notify your security or your local regulator within 24 hours. So that's an interesting concept. And then the other thing, which is probably new to the industry, is the fact that you will have to have security audits on an annual basis, which undoubtedly will incur some costs there. Anyway, that's my quick canter through some of my thoughts on the legal issues, the purpose behind ID, authentication, non-repudiation, and again, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog.